So what do we know from research on the brain? We know that technology enables scientists to observe the brain in action and has led to rapid advances in brain science. We do things like PET scans, MRIs, topical MRIs. We do all different types of magnetic imaging and PET scans. And one of the things that we've learned is that we are able to put people in there and have them actually do activities while they're in there, and so we can see what different parts and regions of the brain are actually firing. Specific parts of the brain process specific types of information in concert with other specific brain sites. So we know that you're just like your verbal cortex just doesn't light up. Might also your visual cortex might light up at the same time your verbal cortex does. So things are not do not happen in just one part of the brain. There's multiple things going on in different parts of the brain. So individuals gain experience in brain functioning, become more efficient. So the more that you do, the more efficient your brain becomes, and the better off you get at it. And early brain development, there's a lot that talked about this in the chapter. We know that early brain development involves adding neural connections, and you prune or you slough off those ones that are not used. There's actually a huge pruning that goes on about age 5. That's why it's hard for a lot of people to remember things that happened before kindergarten, because it's like your brain goes through regeneration, and it wipes part of that away, and things that you no longer need or use are pretty much forgotten, and your brain kind of reboots itself almost at that time. So it's called pruning, and you go through it at different stages in your life, but they do know that the largest one that you go through is at around age 5. Other things that we know about the brain, the auditory is they're at the side of your brain. If right now we're looking at the picture of the brain, if you want to refer back to that, it is, I'm not positive where it is. It's on page 135. Your auditory processing is on the side where it's also in the area with the Broca section of the brain where language is. Your higher intellectual self-control, inhibition, and emotions is in the front of your brain in the cerebral cortex. Your motor and speech production is just above your auditory part of your brain. Voluntary eye movements, your ability to move eyes, is at the top of your head, and then voluntary movement of motor skills is also at the top of your head. Sensations are kind of right there in the middle. Language comprehension, though, is in the back of your head, kind of the back towards the back part. Your vision is also in the back of your head. The where you can, I'm trying to think of what it is. The visual cortex is in the back of your head, and then memory is also over there by auditory. And that's part of your hippocampus that goes along with it. Right there in the center is other things like your amygdala, your hypothalamus, your thalamus, your cerebellum, your corpus callosum, which is the splits your brain in half. It's the nerves that go between your brain. And then your brain stem is your equilibrium and muscle coordination. And they actually say that's the reptilian area because it's similar in all animals, that it's the brain stem, and it controls things like involuntary movements and breathing and heart rate and all that kind of stuff. Your brain development, though, begins about at conception, and it's about the first 4 weeks of gestation. A fetus grows about 200 billion neurons. And the growth and development of the early brain is not a process of straightforward growth, but it's characterized by the forming of connections among neurons, and then it sloughs off some neurons that do not form connections. And it's definitely controlled by experience. For example, children who are deaf, born deaf, the part of their brain that has to do with hearing is far more underdeveloped than those with that are non-hearing. that are hearing. So children who are deaf have a smaller auditory cortex than children who are not. But areas such associated with sight and touch and so on actually are more developed. There's also evidence to suggest that children who are subjected to deprived environments where they're not spoken to or touched suffer long-term brain development. And there happens to be like this window of opportunity that we know about during which children receive stimulation in a given area or in a strength area. These windows are thought to peak in early childhood. Some people say like before age 3. But we know that it's about age 9 for things such as language, vocabulary, and math. And we're not sure if the plasticity of the brain actually goes forward after that. We do know that people who have lost their sense being able to talk and stuff like that are able to get it back. But the rapid ability to form connections typically starts to stagnate around age 9. Researchers believe that in most areas the brain remains adaptable throughout life. However, there's like children they know in Romania who entire sides of their brains don't light up when they were in orphanages and stuff like that, and they were left just like in their cribs. It's a really old study that was done. Dye and Skeels. I want to say it was done in the 20s, but I'd have to look it up. It was before we had ethics again in psychology. One of the things they did was they took kids in an orphanage and they randomly assigned them to being left in their crib and not attended to by the nurses as much as just fed like a couple times a day and stuff like that, or a few times, however long often they feed the kids. And then the other ones, because they wanted to see if environment played a role as not, they let women who were mentally retarded and were put in an institution, they had them feed the babies and play with the babies and hold the babies and rock the babies. And of that study of Skeels and Dye, excuse me, I want to say there were 19 babies that were in the experimental group. They all, except for one, end up not being institutionalized and were out of the orphanage, and they grew up to be having healthy and happy, normal lives. And of the babies who were left just in their cribs, none of them ever made it out of an institution. They were all institutionalized for life. So when we look at this kind of stuff, excuse me, many findings from brain research have important education and child development. We've just hit the tip of the iceberg again on this studies, because we really don't know exactly how we can use this brain research for educational purposes, but there are some definite suggestions like early stimulation of a child's development. Some countries like Sweden actually pay their parents to stay home with their child until they're 3 years old, because they believe that that really helps children in the long run. We do know that the children's development relates to the number of neural connections they make and the synapses that they make, which is the basis for higher learning and memory. So the more that children interact with their environment, the more that they're talked to and they're played with when they're young, the more likely that they're going to have they're going to have good memory and higher learning. And then another important finding in brain research is the discovery that as a person gains in knowledge and skills, his or her brain becomes more efficient. So the more you do it, they say practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the more efficient your brain becomes at doing something and thinking about things. Some implications to the classroom that we know. Not all learning is equally likely. Some types of learning are easier than others. Language, spatial relationships come more easily to young learners than advanced math concepts. Some of the things that Chomsky talks about is that idea of parsing noun, verb, noun, and the mental representation is inferred, but we don't teach that to kids. Kids automatically learn that, and they learn it through their interaction with adults. So they learn it through being able to listen to how their language is constructed, because it's not all noun, verb, nouns in all languages. But it's one of the things that linguists have learned is that we don't teach that to children, just like we don't teach irregular verbs to children, like I go to the store. As children get older, they start to realize that that's not the correct way to say it, even though adding ed is typically normal for most past tense words. We also know that brain development constrains cognitive outcomes. One cannot alter a brain that is not ready for the incoming experience, which is why it's so important to look at the developmental aspects. We keep pushing stuff down right now earlier and earlier in the grades. We're making kids read for kindergarten and all this kind of stuff. And Australia has the highest literacy rate. They're at like 98% of their population is literate. And one of the big differences between Australia and the United States is that they don't starting to teach reading until the kids are age 7. because they said even though some children read before 7, developmentally we know all children are pretty much ready to start reading at 7. So children don't have this bad feeling that they're not good readers. They don't develop a poor self-concept about it. Some regions of the brain may be particularly important for cognitive outcomes and supporting certain sorts of neural activities related to learning and cognition. We know that the prefrontal cortex is really important, and we're going to be doing a lot more research on that. So one of the things that's important, learning has all to do with remembering and forgetting, right? That's what it's all about. You can learn something, but if you don't remember it, you didn't really learn it. So forgetting occurs because information in working memory was never transferred to long-term memory, or if it was transferred to long-term memory, somehow or another it was purged. It can also occur because we've lost access to that information. Maybe it's still there, but we just can't get to it. Interference is what happens when information gets mixed up or pushed aside by other information. I do these little diagrams at the bottom because it's a good example of it. If you teach something too close together that are similar but they're different, sometimes that can interfere with learning. So if you teach, let's say, a line graph, and you do a line graph, children learn to connect the dots and they learn about a line graph, and they start to get really good about that. But a little while later, maybe like a week later or 2 weeks later, the teacher tries to teach scatter plots, and you'll see so many kids that try to draw lines in the scatter plot because they're way too similar in the way they look to be taught that close together. You should wait a little while because otherwise it's going to interfere or inhibit the child's learning because they're going to try and relate it to line graphs, and it's a different concept. So when we look at this, there are individual differences in resistance to interference, and those differences have to do with just a person's genetic makeup. Some people are really good at being able to screen out interference. Other children attend to everything, so they have a hard time picking out just relevant information. Some people would say, like Temple Grandin, who has autism, says that that's probably one of the positive traits of being autistic is your ability to focus on one aspect of something and screen out all other information. So they have she says that's why most good inventors, many inventors, are thought to have been on the spectrum because they have that ability. So when we talk about this, those are talk about facilitation. How do you facilitate remembering? So proactive facilitation is a process where previously information can help a person learn similar information. So if you've already learned Spanish, you would probably have an easier time learning Italian because the words and the cognates of the words are very similar. So it will help you learn learn Italian if you already know Spanish. So that would be a proactive because something that you already know is helping you learn something new. Retroactive facilitation is a process where newly learned information can help a learner with already established knowledge. Like if you learn Latin and you start to learn your prefixes and suffixes of Latin root words, it will help you understand English better. Even though you already know English, it will help you understand it better if you learn Latin. So if we look at retroactive inhibition, and this is inhibition, not facilitation. So inhibition is not being able to remember. If you learn B, a lot of times this happens to small children. They'll learn the letter B and they know the letter B, but then you introduce the letter D, and then all of a sudden they get confused because B and D are very similar. So learning the letter D and B close together sometimes will cause confusion because they're very similar. Proactive inhibition would be like if I already learned to drive on the right side of the road, and I was already driving on the right side of the road, and I went to England, it would be a prohibiting. It would be a retroactive prohibitor that I would have a really difficult time learning to drive on the left side of the road. However, if I never learned to drive, let's say I was from North America and I never got my driver's license, and then I moved to Canada, I would have a proactive inhibition because I didn't have pre-existing knowledge of something. So learning learning to drive on the left-hand side of the road wouldn't be a problem for me because I didn't have this preconceived notion that you're supposed to drive on the right. And then individual differences, we already talked about it, is the inability or the ability to screen out interference and the ability to focus. So children with ADHD, it's not necessarily that they cannot attend, it's that they attend to too many things. So they would have an inability to screen out interference and focus on just one thing, where they would be focusing on everything. And then if you're really good at it, your ability to screen out interferences and focus would give you a leg up, as they would say. So proactive facilitation, once again, is Spanish to Italian. Retroactive facilitation is Latin to English. Knowing Latin will help you with English. And then primacy and recency is probably the other thing that really affects memory. And that primacy is when people tend to remember the first thing and then they remember the last thing. So the last thing you learn tends to be the things that you'll remember. This is really important in teaching because you always want to end your lesson. That's why the conclusion, or when you wrap up your lesson, you always want to go back to what the correct answer is, or what is the purpose of the lesson, because the last thing they're going to remember is the purpose. So if perchance a child says the wrong thing or they get the wrong answer, they're going to remember that wrong answer for a really long time. That's why it's important also to get feedback on the kids' papers quickly, because for 3 or 4 weeks they may be remembering and thinking they got it right when in actuality they'd gotten it wrong. Automaticity is another aspect of remembering, and this has more to do with procedural memory, that you learn to do things automatically. Sometimes motor memory is another part of automaticity. Like your fingers will move if you're an instrument player, if you happen to be a music person and you know how to, you no longer think about where, if you're like on the flute or you're on the trombone or something like that, you don't think about where E is. Your fingers automatically move there. So when they're looking at the notes, the fingers are automatically moving. You don't have to think third finger left, left hand, third finger, push my finger down. It just automatically goes. There's a really interesting, if we went back to the brain, the hippocampus is kind of like the command center for memory. And there's some, if you ever saw that movie 50 First Dates, that woman had damage to her hippocampus. There's really a very famous guy, and if you want to Google him, his name is Clive Wearing, Wearing. And it's really sad to watch him, but he has a memory span of about 2 minutes. And he knows he loves his wife, because your episodic memory is stored in a different part of your brain. He knows he loves his wife and he will hug her, but he has no idea who she is. He doesn't realize it's his wife, but she walks in the room, he runs up and goes, "Hello, where are you? How are you?" And he hugs her and everything, and she says, "Well, you're awfully friendly. Do you know who I am?" And he says, "I have absolutely no idea." And he talks about only becoming aware just a moment ago, and he has this diary and he writes the same thing over and over and over and over again. It was interesting because he was a concert pianist, like for the London Symphony, and or he might have been a conductor. But anyway, if you sit him down in front of a piano and you ask him, like, "Do you know what this is?" He'll say, "I have absolutely no idea." And then he's English, and then they'll ask him, "Do you know how to play?" And he'll go, "I don't think so." And then they put music in front of him, and his hands and fingers just start moving across, and he just plays amazing. And they'll say, "I thought you didn't know what this was." He says, "I don't know. I have any idea what I'm doing." But he has not forgotten that, because his ability to read notes and his fingers to move to those notes have become automatic, and they must be stored in a part of the brain that isn't inhibited by the hippocampus, even though he can't articulate what's happening. So primacy and recency, as we talked about, people tend to remember information at the beginning and at the end, especially the list or class period. Then automaticity is information or skills that may exist in your long-term memory and through practice have become a skill or task that involves little or no mental effort. If you talk about reading too, that would be your Dolch word lists, or your words that are typically found in books like and but. You don't actually sound those words out or anything like anymore. You just read them. That's why people now, if you ever see those things on Facebook where the words are missing, they're only the first and the last letter, and there's none really in between, but you can figure out what the passage is saying. And so that's one of those things that becomes automatic for you. You don't think about reading anymore, you just read. You don't think about driving anymore, you just drive. It's little or no mental effort that goes along with it. And these are the different types of practices that go along with it. Practices that strengthen the dendrites and the newly formed synapses. So when we talk about this, there's a lot of research on distributed practice, which involves practicing parts of a task over a period of time. And it's usually the more effective than mass practice. And a matter of fact, it takes your brain between 48 and 72 hours to actually process what it's learning. So have you ever like studied for something and you're reading in your book and you're like, oh yeah, it's right there by the that picture of the brains and the brain scans, and it's in that paragraph right up there, but you can't remember exactly what it is because it takes your brain that long to figure it out. Or you've studied something, you really don't understand it, and then maybe 2 or 3 days later, all of a sudden you're doing something completely random, and then it pops in your head that you know how to do it, and it makes sense to you because it takes about 48 to 72 hours for your brain to completely store and process the information that you've done. And that's why cramming for exam or math practice, that you usually will purge that memory, that information right after you used it. Enactment, however, is the process of learning by doing, and it also seems to be a really easy way to remember something. So teaching somebody else something usually helps you. Or if you had to construct something or build something that involves you putting the pieces together, usually, or enacting it, like maybe a teacher made you, I told you, well, I didn't tell you guys, but I've told the story before. My son was in a class, and my daughter had her too, Mrs. Dysinger, and she did this Underground Railroad, and you had to smuggle people from room to room. You could be a person who was, I forget the name of, who used to bring the people across, but they would ferry the people through the Underground Railroad, and then they had the slaves themselves, and then some of the administrators would drive around their little golf carts and stuff, and they were trying to catch the slaves, and then there were rooms that had little secret markers on the doors that would tell you whether or not they would, help you if they were part of the Underground Railroad, and they would hide the slaves in the room and stuff. And if you made it to the back fence at the school, you were considered to be a free slave. And so my son was talking about it, and he talked about like how his heart was pounding in his chest, even though he wasn't a slave. He was just trying to help a slave get to freedom. And he was talking about just how powerful that was, and how having those emotions and memory that came with it really helped him learn the material. So can memory strategies be taught? And we've already showed that in the beginning of class, some of the things that we talked about that are useful. And there are definitely ways, it's called mnemonic strategies, that will help us do that. So much of what we do in school are just facts that have to be remembered. And facts form a framework from the simple to the complex. And so the more complex facts that you have depend on you building some kind of a structure that goes along with it. So in order to learn material, it has to be efficiently and effectively portrayed. So you have to be able to plan it and deliver it in a way that shows that there's some kind of structure to it. And you have to leave a little bit of time and memory and for mental energy to give that meaning, the learning, making it meaningful. You want to make it connected to what the children have learned. That's why when you've ever taken a class, maybe that you didn't have a good background knowledge for something, you felt really lost because you didn't have anything to connect it to. And so when we have learning that involves memorization of facts and any kind of arbitrary terms, you have to have some kind of strategies to remember that by. So if we're doing verbal learning, some kind of verbal learning that we see in classrooms are paired associate learning, which involves learning to respond when a member of a pair was given to other members, kind of like states and capitals. If you think about states and capitals and how those two go together, then you have paired associate learning. So one of the things that you want to do is try and come up with chunking that information into little pairs so that they go together. Serial learning involves a list of terms in a particular order, like the Pledge of Allegiance. That's why songs a lot of times are put to some kind of serial learning or poetry or something like that, so that you can, it has a rhythmic flow a lot of times to it. Free recall learning involves tasks that are not in any particular order, but they're clumped together, kind of like organ systems of the body, so that you can kind of like look at the body and think about the body and clump everything together. Other ones are imagery, forming mental images. One bun, lamp, remember, to help you remember those associations. The loci method is another mnemonic device for serial learning that employs imagery. But you do it with a list of locations in your house, or it could be like you're walking to class or you're in a classroom and you try and remember things specific to, if you're in the classroom, you might look at the teacher's desk and think of one thing and memorize it while looking at the teacher's desk. And then you look at a window, and then you're looking at that window and you remember another chunk of information to that window. So that when you look around the room, it will trigger your memory of those specific things that you talked about. One of the things, a lot of ministers and pastors used to use the loci method because they wanted to make sure that they looked at their whole congregation, so they would remember these long passages and speeches by just glancing down and then looking up at different parts of the church, so that they would be able to look at everyone too. The peg word method was one bun, two shoe, three tree. That's when you do those numbers of rhyming words, and then you create mental images that go along with it. And so if you notice, there's mental code images with verbal images, which is the dual code theory. You also have the initial letter strategy, like Roy G. Biv, which are the first ones of the letters of the rainbow. Or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, which goes along with the orders of operation. So what makes information meaningful? Information makes sense and has significance to students and is more meaningful than inert knowledge and information learned by rote. So when you make sense of it, then it has more meaning to it. So rote learning refers to memorization of facts and associations, something like your multiplication tables, the chemical symbols for an element, or words in a foreign language. That's when you're Dolch word lists. Those are rote learning things where you just keep doing them over and over again, and then they just become innate and become automatic in your learning. But meaningful ways, in contrast to rote learning, is not arbitrary, and it relates to information or concept learns that we already have. So if you're even learning a new language, it would be talking about the cognates in that language and some of the root words that are associated to both languages, so that you would be able to figure out what you're talking about. So, or it might be a mathematics problem where you have a kid solve it in multiple ways. Those are meaningful learnings because it gives that information that the child has to tie that information back to something that they've already learned. And then you have inert knowledge. It's knowledge applicable to a wide range of situations, but is applied only to a restricted set of circumstances. Usually inert information is knowledge learned in school that cannot be applied to real life. For example, someone has an A in French class but cannot communicate in Paris. So if you have inert knowledge, like Dr. Hines talked about this the other day, she can read French, like she went to a museum and she was able to pretty much decipher what many things said in French, but she was unable to communicate when she was in Paris. And she said, like, I have this knowledge, but it's not well enough defined enough that I can actually use it on a daily basis. The other part of this that they talk about in the chapter is schema theory. And what it is meaningful information is stored in terms of memory in networks, and it's connected by facts that we call schemata. The most important principle of the schema theory is the information fitting to an existing scheme is more easily understood, learned, and retained than information that does not fit into an existing schema. So if you don't have a schema, you have to create a new schema, and sometimes that's hard to do. So if you look at the picture of the bison on page, I'm not positive where it is, but you start to look at the picture of the bison, what you'll learn is that it's a schema, and it has a bigger schema than what we're talking about. Like you'll look at a bison and you'll say, oh, bison, maybe South Dakota if you've been there before, or Wyoming, and then you say they're an animal. Yeah, they're a mammal. Oh, they're also related to the Native Americans. And so you go into the idea of non-mammal, mammal, non-bison, bison. And then you also do Plains Indian, non-Plains Indian, maybe source of food and clothing if you're looking at Indian, maybe a way of life. You look at languages, you talk about extinction, non-extinction, that might be some of the other things. And then you look at the physical descriptions, food, habits, uses, how it's hunted. All of those are at the bottom tier of your schema, but depending on why you're looking at a bison or the context of which the bison is, your schema would change. If you're in a biology class and you're talking about a bison, if you're an environmental protectionist and you're talking about a bison, you might be talking about the animal. If you're studying Native Americans, or you happen to be in a plain state, you might talk about it in the terms of how Native Americans use bison. So there's so many branches that can go in the schema theory, but they're all interconnected. So when we use metacognitive skills, that means thinking about thinking. We try to help students learn by thinking about their own thinking and controlling and effectively using their thinking processes. The term metacognition means knowledge about one's own learning and how to learn. So thinking skills or study skills are metacognitive skills. And what we know is research on study strategies is confusing. There are a few forms of studying is not effective for everybody. It'll be effective for some people and then not for other people. We have not found a clear-cut, effective strategy that works for everyone. And one of the things that we do know is that it depends on the learner and how the learner reshapes the information. Like rereading and highlighting without consciously choosing the most important information is not effective. However, using like a sticky note and actually summarizing whatever you read at the end of each page has been shown to be effective. But there's other people that when you read it, they don't get the main idea, so it's not effective for them. Study strategies are practice tests, note-taking, selective directed underlining, summarizing, writing to learn, outlining and mapping. When you write to learn, one of the things that you're going to do too is take a chapter and take like the main headers and turn them into questions, and then you're reading to answer that question. Another one that they talk about in the book is the PQ4R method, and it's the idea of preview, question, read, reflect, recite, and review. And if you teach people that PQ4R method, they tend to do better. So it helps. Cognitive teaching strategies help students learn by making learning relevant, and then activating prior knowledge would probably be the two things that you can talk about the most. How do you do that? We make it relevant and activating prior knowledge. Advanced organizers, if you're in Stetson's education program, you have to pretty much have a graphic organizer with every lesson that you teach, and if you don't, you have to tell us why you don't need it. Because advanced organizers help children process information by activating that background knowledge, like a KWL. What do you already know? So I've got a good idea of what that, I'm activating my prior knowledge here. It helps orient the students about the material that they're going to learn. They're going to hear other kids' perspective. Oh yeah, that's what I knew that. And then it's going to also help you recall related information that can assist in incorporating new information. So if you do this advanced organizers, they illustrate that broader principle that activating prior knowledge helps you understand and retain. Some people in the Common Core will now say that you just need the text, you don't need to have prior knowledge. But if I handed you a physics textbook and you'd never had physics before, and 3 other people in the class had physics, and I gave them the physics textbook and I had them read a passage out of it on physics, the 3 people who had prior knowledge of physics would probably have a much easier time understanding the passage than the one person who didn't have prior knowledge in physics. So having prior knowledge is very important. Another way to make it relevant is to use analogies like comparisons or parallels, because it helps you link new information to well-established background information. Elaboration is another one. Actually, one of the things that teaching coaches do is they have teachers tell stories about the concept that's going along with it, because the likelihood that you're going to remember a story is higher than if you're just going to remember the information. So elaboration refers to that process of thinking about ways that connect material to other information that's already in the learner's mind, so that the learner makes a story out of it or makes it their own. Another way that we can organize information is do hierarchical organization, where you can specifically group things, and you use concept maps for that. We might use a bubble map or maybe a double bubble map, so that we can compare and contrast. We can do in hierarchy like the bison one that we just did. so that you can go from the more general to very specific. And then you can use questioning techniques, and that helps students learn from written text, lectures, and other sources to insert questions that they want to ask, or that sometimes teachers will do like an exclamation point, a question mark, and a star when you're reading something. So an exclamation point means, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. And the question mark means, this, I'm not really understanding this. I think I need some more clarification. And then the star means, oh, I've made a connection and I'm going to tell a story about this. And so the teacher will do that, and they give little sticky notes that has that, so that when they get done with reading, they'll go in their circle group and they'll talk about it, and they'll be able to expand on that, and that helps kids remember stuff. Conceptual models like diagrams that will show how like a processes works, like maybe the water cycle or something like that, and how they relate to one another, definitely helps kids remember. And those are all the things that are in Chapter 6.